this session on open science with health and genetic data, a contradiction. This is one of the most exciting, most challenging and interesting topics of data protection today. And this is a panel co-organized by the research infrastructure BBMRI-ERIC and a Nordforsk-funded academic interdisciplinary research project called Governance of Health Data in Cyberspace, where there are 4 partner universities: University of Oxford, University of Uppsala, University of Iceland, and the University of Oslo. We've been very lucky here today to have a great panel with us. We have, from the very beginning here, Jeremy Rollison. Jeremy is Microsoft's Director of EU Government Affairs. We have Michaela Mayrhofer, who is the head of LC Services and Research for the research infrastructure BBMRI-ERIC. We have Claire Gayrel, who's a legal officer at the EDPS. We have Joe Cannataci, who's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. And we have Deborah Mascalzoni, who's a senior researcher at Uppsala University and EURAC Research Center. I will moderate this, and my name is Heidi Bentzen, and I'm with the Norwegian Research Center for Computers and Law at the University of Oslo. When we talk today of open science, we talk about making health and genetic research data available for reuse. Now, why would we want to share this data at all? So the reason why we would want to do this is so it would be possible to reproduce the study findings, to facilitate new discoveries and innovations, and also save resources because it's expensive to generate this data in the first place. And it often requires a high degree of expertise from the ones doing so. We therefore see that research funding bodies and publishers and professional communities are really pushing for open science. And we've just mentioned one example here, but there are many. And the example we're using here is that, as you all know, EU's research and innovation program, Horizon 2020, pushed for open access. And with the new one that's going to start next year, Horizon Europe, they want to go further and also have open access to the data, to the research data as default. With health and genetic data, those are special categories of personal data. And we see that in medical research, that entails massive data processing. And it's difficult, usually impossible, to anonymize the data. So we are well within the scope of the GDPR. And research subjects are typically included with multiple data points. It can be all their genes, for instance, in many data sets. So that sets the stage for this discussion here today. And to kick it off, we will start with Jeremy.
Well, thank you, Heidi. So just to introduce myself, as Heidi said, my name is Jeremy Rollison. I work here in Brussels mostly, but I spend a lot of time in the capitals working with some of our colleagues and customers, particularly increasingly as it relates to all things data sharing and data access. I spent a lot of my time previously working on privacy topics, and so this is kind of a natural output of that. I also had a background working in copyright and IP. And so both of those topics and subjects have been super important in terms of understanding where the obstacles and some of the opportunities are from a regulatory perspective on some of the projects that our customers are increasingly engaged in when it comes to access to data. You can imagine in any type of project, there are barriers that arise, especially when you're processing personal data, concerns and considerations that you have to make. There are also IP obstacles that can come up, and some of what Heidi just mentioned there reminds me of some of the work we've done recently in the policy framework and getting more of that open access mindset to be reflected in IP law, which had previously been a little bit more restrictive in terms of what you could do with some of the new computational analysis now that powers a lot of these type of machine learning projects. But when it comes to data sharing, there's been a lot of noise about that in Brussels for the past 6 months with the new European Commission coming in. Everyone's talking about data sharing in the context of AI. And we're talking about ways to be competitive and unlock some of the next generation breakthroughs and research outcomes. It's really exciting. It's really exciting, and I think you see a lot of reference to this because it's seen as a way of staying competitive, and we talk about it in a manufacturing context, and we talk about it there, and also driving really exciting outcomes, especially when we talk about it in a health context. Health is one of the sectors or areas, I think, where you have some of the most excitement because some of the breakthroughs and the possibilities that have come for machine learning and AI potential have just really exciting ways that they can touch people's lives. I think policymakers and citizens and of course researchers get really, really excited about the new opportunities they have to analyze data more quickly, more effectively, working with others, combining these data sets to drive research outcomes in a health space that have diagnostic benefits, that have research. I mean, it goes and we can always get excited. It almost seems like every day we're learning about new projects. That's the exciting part and the opportunity. But of course, when we're talking about these type of data sets, we're talking about some of the most sensitive data sets. And when we're talking about different researchers accessing different data sets that he or she may not have compiled, might not necessarily have the original access rights to, can be very, very far removed from the original user. Naturally, again, we're talking about such sensitive data, there's more considerations that need to be taken into account. It is a sensitive core category of data. The GDPR obligations that are there go without saying. So it's, when I look at it, I work on this topic from also a manufacturing perspective, an automotive perspective, a banking perspective, but health is the one that really kind of stands out, and I think where we have some of the most exciting projects going on right now, and I think where policymakers and even citizens get the most excited potentially. Nonetheless, we're talking about, again, some of the most sensitive data sets that we could be operating with. We're a technology company, so we get excited about this like anybody else, but we get excited about it as well from the ways that technology can help power many of these research breakthroughs and outcomes, how they can facilitate this type of research. I think we're also increasingly excited or optimistic, at least about the way technology can address some of the concerns that Heidi outlined in the presentation and address some of the concerns people would naturally have about the data that's being processed in this context. With a lot of academic partners and others, we've been driving trends in privacy-enhancing technologies, not just within our software tools, but across academic communities more broadly. I think ways of de-identifying data or ways of encrypting data throughout its life cycle in ways that provide a researcher the opportunity to analyze that data, work with that data, make conclusions from that data, and provide it back, all the while without necessarily even accessing the original data sets themselves. Creating digital ciphers, not differential privacy, I'll come to that in a minute, but confidential computing, some of the things we're doing at the edge. You know, we're often providing the platforms that power these joint research projects. So it'll be somebody like Heidi and her organization that may be contributing data to a project that's being processed by other parties who are part of the project. And I think we're powering platforms that can address some of the concerns about that other party only having access to the type of data that it needs for the specific part of its project in a way that doesn't necessarily compromise any of the original users themselves. Getting consent in this space for a sensitive data category, it's crystal clear that you would need consent for legal basis for processing. The good news is that I think when we look at willingness of patients and citizens to share such health data for research purposes, we get pretty positive responses. I can think of, Belgium had a study about 2 years ago where it was something like 90% of patients were willing to contribute some of their patient data in Belgian hospitals if it was going towards medical research. Some of the polling there and statistics from patients seems to be pretty high. But at the same time, it gets a little bit different when you talk about it in individual use cases and different use cases that we have. Some of that sensitivity goes up. And say, well, wait a second, who's using that data? I mean, and who would they share it with, and who will they share it with, and what happens to it later? How is it protected, et cetera? That's understandable. And I think it's one of the reasons why with GDPR, again, this is a sensitive data category, there were secondary use exceptions there that we're trying to understand a little more how it will unlock some of that potential. Some of the data sets that we're working with are data sets that may have been collected or data sets we'd like to work with and customers would like to work with, or things that were collected for one purpose, and can they be used then for another? Can you go back and get consent to patient records and the like, where it's not, you maybe identify the patient as such, but being able to identify him or her in a way that will allow them to go back and get consent for this new project, the outcomes of which sometimes are only a bit known as we get further down the line. You can imagine all the problems that arise. So I think our role in this and our excitement about it, and where some of our customers and partners have been most engaged, is the way that technology can help address some of those concerns. There's the opportunity side that we've talked about, machine learning, AI, throwing massive computing power at large data sets to come out with exciting, identify the patterns, get the outcomes. That's great. We're also looking at the ways the technology can power that project in the first place so that the project can still take off without having to stall because of regulatory and legal concerns. Another aspect of this is when it comes to the type of agreements that would be put in place. Over the summer, we released several template agreements for a variety of scenarios that would, from our perspective, help legally address the ways that different partners in a project can rely on the activities of the others to be done in a legal way. We see it more in the startup community where legal lawyers and things get involved and then projects stall. We've made a contribution to make sure that thing keeps moving forward. So technology, legal frameworks, and encouragement from policymakers are something we're happy to be a part of, and looking forward to hearing more today.
Thanks, Jeremy. And as you understand, we've chosen a format here today where each speaker gets 8 minutes to give a bit of an introduction to the topic from their point of view. And if there are any very short clarifying questions, purely clarifying questions, you can come up and do those after each of the presentations. If not, we will have the panel discussion at the very end here. So please save all of your very good discussion points for the end. And with that, I give, unless there are any clarifying questions to Jeremy's talk, I will give the word to Michaela Mayrhofer.
Well, for BBMRI, this is the third time that we are at this conference, and it's always a pleasure. Still, I always feel the necessity to explain briefly what BBMRI is, other than an acronym and a mouthful to say. And BBMRI stands for Biobanking and Biomolecular Research Infrastructure, and the ERIC for the legal entity that we have, European Research Infrastructure Consortium. And we have the inside joke that if you can say it without stumbling, then you're exempt from the membership fee, which I clearly have to pay now because I stumbled myself. What I want to do is to contextualize and to talk about the fields that BBMRI is operating in, and that is in the field of research infrastructures. Research infrastructures were put together by and on the S3 roadmap, the European Research Infrastructure are intended to overcome the fact wherever science needs to move forward, to go from the short term of 3 to 6 years to 8 years that the typical project life cycle allows, into a longer sphere to benefit not only a small consortium, but a wider group of researchers in the European field. And among those, there are 13 that are linked to the biological and medical sciences, reading from clinical trials to data points to BBMRI. BBMRI deals with biobanks, Elixir with data, and Ecran, for instance, with clinical trials. What they all have in common, besides the topic of biological and medical sciences, is that open science is a big topic, and that they're collaborating in various projects within EOSC, so EOSC Pilot, EOSC Hub was one of the projects where we are all as research infrastructures in one way or the other involved in. But also we have a collaborative sphere in order to enable ourselves to create an open digital and collaborative space, because obviously what is open science for one research infrastructure means slightly something different in another. Then the other catchword is obviously fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. What does that mean? How do we bring it together with the different fields, nonetheless, that we're coming from? And let alone the different languages that we speak, because it is an interdisciplinary endeavor. Now, how to best exemplify? Obviously, to talk about the things that you know best, and I hope I know my organization best. And for us, the FAIR principles are obviously something we commit to, but need further specification, as BBMRI operates in the realm from population-based biobanks to clinical biobanks, obviously highly sensitive data. We wanted to stress that the quality aspects need to be put forward when it comes to the research reproducibility, that incentives need to put forward that allow enrichments of data sets, but as well as access, reuse, sharing, and all that goes with it, openness. And with this, I can point to an argument that is known in our community since a while. Actual figures are not out there, but only estimates. How much, in average of all the biobanks, do you think is an average biobank sharing? The estimates go between 7 to 15%. And what everybody agrees on, this number is appalling and has to change and has to increase. That is one of the reasons why and how FAIR can contribute, why the research infrastructures exist. And all of this has to be done with privacy-respecting approaches, working in the different member countries in collaboration with other research infrastructures and obviously research consortia. The graph that you see here represents the realm of BBMRI, how secure data versus open space is from us depicted. And you see that the citizens is somewhere in and somewhere out. Because it...
Yeah.
Oh dear.
We're having technical difficulties.
Okay. Well, in the end, I'm happy to share the slides with all of you later on. And if you have questions, then I'm always happy to answer. The other slide that you obviously are not seeing talks about process of applying safeguards. So I'm talking about data minimization, pseudonymization, anonymization. And we have the original data in one end and anonymized data in the other. And in the middle, we have data minimization for a particular purpose. We have the GDPR space. Therein lies obviously also the pseudonymized data. But the non-GDPR space is always negotiable and depends on the context. Is it a residual risk? And is the data truly anonymized that we can use it? In order to overcome and to find practical solutions for how to deal with the GDPR, non-GDPR space, and to accustom the reality, is that we commit to to develop a code of conduct for health research, where we are thinking that where we are convinced that health research takes place in the intersection between machine learning and healthcare. Now, in the realm of healthcare, you have everything from very modernized systems to 20 different data sets with, and tools and systems within one clinic. So the reality one also has to admit is that a USB stick or a sheet of paper is carried from one institute to the next. This is the reality we live in, and it has to be traded off against the best intentions to advance research in healthcare and to realize the open science cloud. We have started with the secondary use of data and are aiming wherever possible that data is reusable. Reusable in the sense that, reusable in the sense that, reusable in the sense that everything has, of course, to follow a legal basis for the usage of data, has to follow quality controls, and should allow to move healthcare and science forward. And the intersection, especially with the e-health initiatives, becomes more and more important. Now, as we have, thank you, as we have the chance now that I can show you the 2 slides that were missed out, here is the beautiful graph that shows the intersection and secured space in the clinic, the biobank, BBMRI-ERIC, where any data is only shared in a space where open access means open access for researchers, but not open access yet for anyone. And whenever there's an innovation topic, this has to still be negotiated where the boundaries are. The argument I was making earlier, and with the graph I can make much easier now that it's visible for you, is that the citizens are somewhere in and somewhere out as research participants, for one. When they are patients, typically they're very interested in collaborating with science. However, we do not always have the identity, or being a patient is one of the many identity labels that we have. If it's a chronic disease, if it's a rare disease, you might have it all your life. If it is something in form of an intervention, you have it maybe for a couple of months, or maybe in the last, if it's a deadly disease, of your life. Now, moving to my last slide, what we're talking about, in my opinion, has always related to the question, what are we protecting, sharing, and exploring? What do we want to achieve with what we are doing? And in that sense, I always like to call this what we are protecting, the NEMA argument. Every one of you knows, I presume, the movie Finding Nemo, and there's the dialogue between Merlin, the father fish, and Dory, the fish who forgets everything. Maybe he could be seen as, or she could be seen as the right to be forgotten, as a depiction of it. And the dialogue says, Merlin as a father, I'm absolutely scared that something is happening to little Nemo. And Merlin and Dory then replies, well, that's an odd request, because if nothing is happening to little Nemo, then literally nothing at all is happening, and nothing is also moving forward. And that is the context that we're operating in. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Michaela. And thank you also for giving such a great presentation, even with the technical difficulties. We now move on to Claire Gayrel from the EDPS. And she does not have a PowerPoint presentation, so no worries about the technical issues.
I don't have any presentation. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Claire Gayrel. I'm legal officer at the EDPS. And thank you for this invitation to take part in the panel on open science. It's particularly timely for us because we, as EDPS, just released earlier this month our preliminary opinion on data protection and scientific research, which I advertised now, and you can consult and read this opinion on our website. We also invite people to react or send comments in writing if you want. So voilà, so this is a good opportunity for me, of course, to present a little bit some elements of our opinion, which is broader than open science. We are addressing several issues in this opinion, which are not exclusively related to open science, but many elements of how at the EDPS we understand how data protection law approaches scientific research are in this opinion. And I will come back a little bit to this, because I think these are general messages that are useful to convey, and this is how at the EDPS we understand how the GDPR has tackled scientific research, deals with that, and this is useful for open science. So first, scientific research occupies a privileged position in the GDPR. The GDPR adopts a rather liberal approach with respect to the processing of personal data in the specific context of scientific research. And I remind that now because we are observing increasing concerns from the scientific community that the GDPR is impeding research, that the GDPR may kill innovation, may prevent processing of personal data for advances in knowledge and so on. And so we have to remind and explain and maybe what is the rationale in the GDPR with respect to scientific research. And in our view, we consider indeed that scientific research deserves a special regime in the GDPR because research is a public good destined to increase society's stock of knowledge, which is a key priority for the EU. So this specific regime is meant for scientific research. There is a lighter regime justified then by the importance of science for society. There are several derogations. There is a possibility to derogate to the so-called purpose limitation principle. Maybe not all of you are familiar with so-called presumption of compatibility, which allows to further use personal data for other purposes than for which they were initially collected. There are derogation or possibility to derogate to the principle of limited retention. There are possibilities now in the GDPR to process personal data without consent as a lawful ground. And there are possibilities to derogate to the information of data subjects under certain circumstances, but when the data are collected from third parties. And there are possibilities to establish by law derogations to some of the core data subjects' rights of access, rectification, restriction, and right to object. So taken altogether, we can clearly understand that the legislator tried to accommodate the general regime of protection of personal data with the specific needs of scientific research for more flexibility under certain aspects. But having said that as well, this doesn't mean that the GDPR allows the endless retention and use by anyone for any scientific purposes of personal data without individuals having ever consented to such uses or even being aware of what's going on and which processing of personal data takes place. And this on the basis of a very wide conception of research or scientific research. So this, we consider that this special regime, scientific research cannot legitimize an excessively liberal interpretation of the GDPR either, because the higher standard of the Charter remains, and Article 8 of the Charter is still there. Some core elements like purpose limitation principle, right of access, lawfulness, and rectification are enshrined in the Charter itself. So this means that we have to understand the scope of these exemptions, derogations, and flexibility in the light of the higher standard, which is the one established in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So this is why, and I'm also saying that now because I also address another concern, which is the fact that maybe on one side we have a part of the scientific community which is worried about the GDPR, has difficulty maybe to integrate it into its own practice and so on. And on the other side, we may have other stakeholders who actually understands that the GDPR allows them to do whatever they want and that there is no problem with the scientific research regime under the GDPR. And so this is also why I'm reminding that indeed there is a clear flexibility provided in the GDPR, but this does not allow an excessively liberal interpretation of this provision. The standard established in the Charter must be kept in mind. So we should keep in mind all this when we think about open science and making health and genetic research data available for reuse, as you defined it, Heidi, for the purpose of this panel today. So this is why it is our understanding that making genetic research data available for reuse cannot mean that genetic data or health research data should be freely available for any use by anyone. This is not, I would say, an open science policy that would adequately balance the right to personal data protection with freedom of art and science and find an adequate balance. And here I will address mainly two angles or two pillars of what we think are crucial for an appropriate open science policy. The first one is that availability for reuse of health and genetic data should be limited to genuine scientific research. The sharing of personal data always involves a degree of risk to the people concerned by the data, including where the purpose is scientific research. And it is our view, the EDPS view, and we explain that in our opinion, that the special regime provided for scientific research in the GDPR is not meant to apply to any activity deemed to be research. We consider that the special regime is primarily destined to apply to scientific research subject to relevant sectoral standards of methodology and ethics and carried out with the aim of growing society's collective knowledge and well-being, as opposed to serving primarily one or several private interests. So this is particularly important for the EDPS that we come up with a very well-defined notion of scientific research. And the last point is that open science should be combined with a certain degree of control. And this is where a notion of informed consent, and not necessarily as a lawful ground for processing, but as an ethical safeguard, are crucial to maintain a certain degree of control for individuals and of trust of citizens in our scientific community.
Thank you so much, Claire. So we now move on from this excellent overview of open science from the EDPS point of view and over to a global perspective with Joe Cannataci, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy.
So, yes, just set it up. So good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. Thank you very much, Heidi and Michaela, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be able to invite you to reflect about the real-life problems that we have. And I'll start with a global example where completely coincidentally, Microsoft was also involved. Just to give you an idea, I mean, during my short presentation today, I'm going to try to explain to you what the net result has been of my mandate's consultation on the right to privacy in the healthcare sector, or to be more precise, for all kinds of health data, including the data which is generated by your Fitbits and other wearables on your mobile phones. But Before that, I thought I'd give you a flavor of some of the cases that I meet as I go around the world trying to do the job of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. And I'll give you one example. And I'm sure that many of you remember the film Minority Report, right? And pre-crime. Well, think about pre-health, right? Because one of the cases that I saw over the past 6 months was precisely that. So in one particular state of Argentina, there are more teenage pregnancies than all of the EU put together. And that was a concern to the health authorities there, to the social security authorities. So what they did was they got together with Microsoft and they pooled data together. Think about the area that Michaela showed us, right? But there they put together social security data, health data, some hospital data. And before you know it, I was inspecting a database which not only showed pictures of the child at each month because they wanted to weigh the child and make sure that the child was in line with growth areas, but also the house of the child, the wall of the yard of the house of the child, the street of the wall of the house of the child, the mother of the child. And when I saw this program, which was touted to me as being highly successful, they said it's 88% successful, and it's so successful that other states in Argentina are trying to contract to get the same system. That they told me Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile are coming to speak to us to get the same system. And then I asked the question, okay, but you do understand the risks that you have here with this data, do you? Can I see the privacy impact assessment, please? And the answer was, what? What are the principles of privacy by design that you have followed and the principles of privacy by default that you have followed? And you can guess what the answers were. And this is where you come to realize that you ask yourself the question, if the GDPR made sense for us after not 6 years of discussion. Remember that everything that is in the GDPR when it comes to medical data has been coming there for more than 25, 40 years, right? I was chair of the Council of Europe's Committee of Experts on Data Protection and piloted recommendation 97.5 on health data, which lies at the basis of most of the principles that you will find today in the GDPR. And that was 25, 28 years ago, right? So it's been a long time coming. Many countries and many experts of many countries have tried to work out the best way forward. And from a UN global point of view, I naturally asked the question, do we need to reinvent the wheel? Can we use 40 years of discussion? And my answer was yes, which is why more than 2 years ago, I started the process of putting a task force of experts on data protection and health data from around the world. And I'm grateful to Heidi, who's one of them, who joins us here today. And we went through all the available rules, regulations, ideas, articles that we had about the subject. We put out an online consultation. We got more than 900 suggestions to the base text that we put online. This is a meeting. I'm grateful to the Council of Europe for having co-hosted a meeting we held in Strasbourg in June of last year to discuss the document. And I then, as you can see from some of the next slides, presented that document to the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 29th of October of last year. So it's just 2 months ago, just under 3 months ago, that I've made this document public. So as you can see, the headlines went out that we're proposing global protection standards. And what I'd like to tell you, of course, is that when we worked over the past 2 years to put together these global protection standards, we try to make sure that they're completely GDPR compatible, that they're completely compatible with the Council of Europe's new document on medical data, health data, which was published in April of last year, and they're compatible with, of course, the United Nations jurisprudence on human rights. When the press release came out about the new guidelines, obviously the media section at the United Nations was more concerned sometimes in looking at the enormous privacy concerns. And there are privacy concerns, because if you listened carefully to the three excellent presentations that went before me, you would have noticed that we're talking about spaces, we're talking about approaching research in a responsible way, in defining research properly. Not everything that is called research is research. And the point is, there are several entities out there who are trying to cash in on health data. And we have to face this fact that many people are out to get your health data and mine in order to make money of it. Which is why, very quickly, if you want to get the text, I've already been told that in a minute I have to shut up. So just go to the UN website. It's not very user-friendly, but if you go to the report, to the part on annual reports, you'll be able to see the section there which talks about, and you have the full version there, as well as a summary version. There are 42 pages of full version, which at the latest version is 5th December. We continued refining it, so it's 5th December. There's also an explanatory memorandum of another 40 pages or so to help you understand what's going on. From the table of contents itself, and this is the penultimate slide before I stop, from the table of contents you can see that it is actually a very extensive set of recommendations which we have put together. Of course, there are sections on health data and open data. Of course, there are sections on scientific research. It's one of the longest sections. Of course, there are sections about genetic data. It's one of the longest sections. But if you want to know more about it, you either have to read the text or else you're going to have to ask me questions. So thank you very much. I'm stopping here, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. And we will now move on to the data subject perspective. And to present that, we have with us Deborah Mascalzoni from Uppsala University in Sweden and EURAC Research Center in Italy. And she's one of the researchers on the research project Governance of Health Data in Cyberspace, and she will present the results, some of the preliminary results from that project.
Yes, in this project, we tried to look at individuals' perspectives and stakeholders' perspectives on what governance models could be appropriate for using health data in cyberspace for big data use. Of course, identifying socially, legally, and ethically compliant thresholds is not an easy endeavor, as there are sometimes clashes between needs for research uses and, as I said, socially acceptable thresholds. So, health-related data and genetic data in the big science agenda really face a high degree of sensitivity. We are talking here about a huge amount of often very, very sensitive data, genetic information, imaging, health information, sometimes genealogical information. Also, biomedical research has been characterized by a huge increase in technological and scientific advances, where web sharing and new imputation techniques allow reconstructing data of missing participants if the data set is big enough, which means also having implications for future generations that didn't participate in research, but that can be tackled by the huge amount of information that is available. So we need to find a legal and social balance of current practice between governance in the use of data and risk, and at the same time allowing research to happen, of course. So in our project, we investigated whether current laws, regulation, and policies are appropriate for current practices, and we explored with individuals if those practices are socially acceptable and whether there are specific perceptions by citizens on what should be done in order to implement those. So we know that there is a research tension between socially acceptable thresholds and needs in the use of cyber health. On the one side, you would like to have controlled flows. On the other side, you would like to have a very free flow of data, strong legal frameworks on one side, and very flexible mechanisms on the other side. Identified actors and plural actors and reuse of data widely. And identified users and uses versus wide uses. So already existing mechanisms proved not to be always in line with the current regulations, for instance, the GDPR. And in our legal analysis, one of the results was to identify the fact that current databases that host genetic data needs to be revised in light of the GDPR. But our main goal now was to look at stakeholders' perceptions, and the first part of our project looked at expert and citizen focus group in their perception of governance and of fears with regard to wide data sharing. We used vignettes or like case studies, let's say, with small changes in order to identify where the problems were and what were the preferences of the stakeholders. This will be the basis for a follow-up with this choice experiment, where a similar approach will be used in a more standardized way in 5,000 people in Norway, Sweden, UK, and Iceland. So we will present small case studies with changes. We already performed 13 focus groups and quite a few in-depth interviews with stakeholders between June and October 2019. And the main result is that currently the population is quite IT literate. Everyone at least has a smartphone, and they access the cyber world. So they kind of understand much better than, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago, what we're talking about when we talk about sharing data in the cyberspace. We don't have a lot of time, but some preliminary results of our focus group is that there are some fears related to this data access and open data access. And the biggest fear from citizens was that it would be harmed financially if their data were misused, for instance, by insurance companies or employers. The conditions under which data sharing is occurring is also a matter of concern. And of course, the cost benefit that stakeholders are putting in is towards getting better healthcare and better results that could improve their life. So it's not a very general, let's see that society will improve in general, but really also a personal gain somehow. Of course, a positive impact for society is seen as a plus, but there are some expectations that may seem not very realistic according to how data is used nowadays. So people are expected to be informed on how their data is used, to have some degree of control over that flow, especially if private companies or gains of certain types are involved. Also, which was a very worrisome result for me, is that people expect that data are treated securely, which means securely, not to a certain degree of security as we understand it, and anonymously, which, as Heidi was pointing out before, is quite impossible with, for instance, genetic data and genomic data, which is the area that I'm working with. So we are in a moment in which we face some legal advice on one side, some ethical advice on the other side, some push from the research side on the other side, and those words seems to kind of collide, and like the law seems very strict sometimes. But what we're facing is that, in fact, at the moment, we don't even know if the law as it is facing the global challenges that we are facing today. So 6th of December, this was an article in the New York Times. China uses DNA to map faces quite effectively, so that coupled with technologies on facial recognitions, they are able to identify people. And this is a new technology that can have a huge impact on genetic data sharing, as you can understand. If from a genetic information you can derive a face and then an identity, sorry. I'm Italian, so I'm moving all the time. And also, there are techniques for which, through a facial image, you can derive health information through a proper diagnosis. Heidi was part of this research. So now, this is really an open question for the audience. Are we facing the new challenges with proper instruments, or should we rethink what the governance model should be for our use of data? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for giving us the data subject perspective. We will now open up for a panel discussion and questions from the audience. We also have a couple other questions we are happy to post, but we will mix and match a bit. I see Barbara getting up here, so maybe we will just kick off with you.
Thank you, Heidi. That was really provocative, and I'd like to thank Joe especially for bringing up the potential commercial abuses, because I think that is the greatest fear. As a scientist, I would say you don't have that much fear from science, because we're tightly regulated with ethics committees and at universities and so on. If you want to do your research a little bit more flexibly, you can work with a commercial company and you can actually subvert ethics, and that is the fear. And when we've done research on patients and participants and subjects, they don't fear the scientists as much. They fear the abuse by commercial entities and the making of money on data. What is more critical is, and I think comes to the last speaker, is the question of not only this misuse to make money, but this misuse to then bring about bad science. If data is poorly interpreted, you can actually come up with worse consequences, and then you can mislead the public. So I wanted the panel's opinion on whether there should be better regulation of the data protection officers who is accountable for the data, and whether there ought to be almost a profession of data managers, as we have with medics and scientists and so on, and lawyers.
Go for it.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And once again, we'll start with a reality check, right? And I'll relate this to the subject of open data and big data, which is then related to medical data. Have you ever passed by a politician's office, a constitutional surgery, and seen a queue of people asking the politician, oh, please, please, give companies our data? I've never seen that. If you do, please take a picture and send it to me immediately. Because what I find is that the people who are lobbying for open data and actually receiving medical data and related data collected by public authorities are actually companies. Those companies want it for various reasons, but eventually most of their companies are all-for-profit companies, and therefore they are looking at their bottom line, rightly so. There's nothing wrong with making a profit. It's how you make the profit and which rules you break in trying to make the profit, which can worry us. So in direct response to your question, people like the IAPP will answer you, oh, but there's already a data professional. We're trying to make sure to raise standards among the data protection officers. What I see, though, is also a greater need for education. It's absolutely useless having data protection officers educated around the world if people are merely signing away their rights over their personal data. So the real risk, I think, is all those people who are bombarded by ads from Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and a whole bunch of other things, the new Fitbits and watches they buy, etc. They don't read the small print, they just sign off. They've just signed off their rights over the data, and when you read the small print, in many cases, they have sold irreversibly in a number of countries the rights over the data. So what we are trying to do here is take the standards which have been established in Europe especially, but in some other countries too, over the past 40 years, and put meat on the bones, because GDPR is not enough. That's why you have 42 pages of recommendations, because we wanted to go deeper and try to bring out the thinking behind it, and then spread those standards around the world. Most importantly, though, we need to make citizens aware of what they are giving away every time they use a device which gives away health data.
Thank you. And Michaela asked for the word.
It is a chance to follow up on the argument of education, to which I could not agree more, because I would even say that all of us here are not fully digital natives. And as a society, we have to come to that. And that requires to educate us on a professional level, on a science level, as parents, as colleagues as well. And that is going to be a hard chore. Think of the New York Times privacy project, where it was reported that if you would read out loud the Amazon privacy statement, it takes you about 72 hours. So I assume that all of you have, of course, read all the privacy statements that you clicked on. And if we were not doing it, who are supposedly experts in some areas, if in the field, we can imagine what is going on out there. As regards to the issue of science in this, I think here comes in the responsibility of science. Again, in how we conduct it, how we communicate it, which links also to science communication, to not recreate another hype, but to really be honest and truthful about what we can deliver. And to close with a comment from the biobanking field, the majority of biobanks are small scale in the clinic. They have their use, they have their purpose. However, in terms of communication, they are challenged by the expectations raised by companies like 23andMe, and the consumer experience that they can offer. And equally so, this is a reality that has to be tackled. What is it really that can be protected, how, and be accountable for the actions?
Thanks. And let me just add that the Norwegian Research Center for Computers and Law, we have actually read the terms and conditions, and it's on YouTube. So just before we move on to David's question here, a short comment perhaps from Jeremy. Should we be afraid of Microsoft and all the other commercial companies?
Well, I don't think every company is the same. I certainly hope people aren't too fearful of Microsoft. I think it's just important to remember that these projects and the companies that are engaged in them, whether it's collection of consumer data, whether it's providing software that powers the type of text and data mining analysis that goes into research journals, you know, there are a lot of differences in the sense of the ways that technology can help power health research and open science outcomes. So it really depends a lot on the project. I can totally, and I know that as a company, and it's mostly our customers, you're well aware of the sensitivities in this space, and I think there's an incentive there to be overly cautious. Most of our customers have an even overly cautious sensitivity to that and want to see ways that the tools can address all of the potential negative outcomes that could emerge. So we're seeing more and more of that demand. I just think, you know, that scientists and research, they need tools, and especially some of the more exciting tools that can make these advances more quickly. But it's a balancing act. You know, I don't want anybody I want full control over what happens to my data, just like anyone else, and I can fully appreciate all of the statistics in that sense. So I thought Deborah's presentation was really helpful in showing that if you ask me, do I want commercial company A having access to my data and being able to share it with others, the answer is no. Do I want to support health research outcomes and better health care? Absolutely. I think a lot of questions come to the points that you made on there. What happens when a commercial company gets that data? Does it then fall into the hands of my insurer? Does it fall into the hands of my employer? Does it fall into the hands of somebody who can have a decision that significantly impacts my life legally, or even when we're talking about health, even more life consequential? It's a fascinating space, but there is still a lot of excitement about some of the outcomes that can be powered, and I hope that people understand that all the companies are having different roles to play there.
Yeah, thank you. David, we'll move on to your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for putting together this stellar panel and great moderation. It's been a pleasure to be in the audience. So my name is David Chakoshvili. I work for a company that's active in genomics, and my role is Regulatory Affairs and Bioethics Manager. So I have a question to the panel, particularly I would say to Michaela and Deborah, but anyone feel free to chime in. So you discussed quite extensively sharing of genomic data, as in sharing among institutions and research entities. But is there any activity going on with respect to sharing genomic data with subjects or source individuals, especially when requests are made? So as you probably know, GDPR allows individuals to request their raw data, genomic data, and what are the activities in this regard?
Deborah, would you like to?
I think it's quite different when an individual wants to have his or her own data available for different purposes. Usually is patients that wants to share this data for health reasons and so on, and us taking the initiative to share those data. Because then the responsibility and the is quite different. Then, of course, there are people that put their own raw data online, because this is also a reality. But again, this is their own choice. I couldn't agree more on the fact that we need to be more cautious and more aware of what this means and what the implications could be. Because there are political uses of those data. I mean, people are profiled, ethnically profiled in some countries, and put in camps based on their genetic profile. So even though we live in Europe, in this regard, in a bubble of democracy and of we are all nice, this is not the reality of the world. And this can change. I mean, we have a history that tells us. Also, I wish to add to that, I don't really differentiate so much between academia and private companies, honestly. Because, of course, there are some safeguards in some universities, but the landscape is quite differentiated, even across Europe. And the safeguards in place are quite different in different countries. There are countries where you don't have the obligation of ethical review board if you're using data, for instance. So in this case, I would see the risk of research completely uncontrolled going on. Also, I see companies that are developing useful tools for society and research that is not necessarily useful. So I don't think that the bad and the good are all on one side. I mean, that's not the point at all. The point is really, can we develop tools to allow safe sharing, for instance? And I think, and I asked Claire about this, that also the availability of raw genomic data is also still a point under discussion. And in some countries there are proposals of allowing that only under genetic counseling, for instance. But that's, again, is very different.
For raw data or interpreted data?
For raw data.
Also for raw data.
Yeah.
So thank you, Deborah. I think we've touched now quite a lot on the risks and benefits to research participants in this field. To close off the session, I suggest that each of you take a minute to tell us how open science ought to be governed, which safeguards should be established to protect research participants' health and genetic data. Michaela, would you like to kick us off?
Whatever safeguards are put in place, they have to be technological, institutional, educational, but most importantly, cultural. Whatever company culture, academic culture that you have, it has to be lived, otherwise it's completely useless.
Claire.
Yeah. At the EDPS, and we have provided some elements about that in our preliminary opinion. We strongly believe that this is a question of interdisciplinarity, first, that the governance should involve more dialogue between data protection authorities and ethical review boards, because both competencies are necessary around the table to elaborate an appropriate governance framework. I tend to think a little bit like Deborah, that this is more than private against public, private companies against public interest or academic research. The situation is a bit more complex. And this is also why we have elaborated on what means scientific research. And we care very much about dissemination of research results, appropriate oversight. So whether conducted under the private sector or public sector, what is key is an appropriate oversight to avoid the situations of loopholes of protection where research areas are clearly outside the radar of anybody, and the well-being and increase of society's knowledge, stock of knowledge, so as opposed to serving exclusively or primarily commercial interests. So we think that this is key, and that the appropriate governance model will necessarily imply interdisciplinarity and more dialogue between different stakeholders.
Thank you. Joe?
Yes, thank you. Well, since I only have a minute, I'll be very grateful to the previous two speakers by agreeing with them and then building on what they had to say. I tend to be slightly old-fashioned in finding that the old safeguards within the kind of space that Deborah was talking about worked relatively well in the newest situation described here. In other words, we should stick as much as possible to an approach which is ad hoc to each and every research requirement. Not all research is the same, not all data is the same. I'd like to emphasize too that we should be moving towards a position where if Microsoft is approached, and of course not all companies are the same, if other companies are approached, the first, and this is what I am driving towards, the first reaction should be, wherever you are in the world, outside Europe too, and perhaps especially, is, okay, you want us to do this for you, have you done your privacy impact assessment? What are we as a company supposed to be doing to affect privacy by design, to affect privacy by default? Where are the safeguards built in? And this is where I think, and why I build up on, and I'll conclude on what Michaela was saying, it's a question of culture. The privacy safeguards have got to be baked into the process, baked into the culture, and that will only happen if education, law, and the health data research field comes together in order to make sure that the direction we drive across the world is the right one, without allowing for a large number of countries which continue to make unfettered use, as we saw some of the screens about China, etc., unfettered use of genetic and other data, which is really not the way to go. Thank you.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I think some of that cultural shift that we mentioned, some of that's happening, post GDPR, I think, in many companies at least. In an AI context, we're seeing it happen internally as well, with the establishments of ethics committees that review these projects that might be in a gray zone of, would we feel comfortable doing something like that with that type of partner? Will they be trusted to have the right type of controls and the like? I think as the AI opportunities start to emerge more and more, you'll see more and more pressure for those type of ethics discussions to happen internally, not just at a political level, but inside companies. So I think that's part of the solution as well.
Thank you. Deborah?
I think that we have been trying to govern the flow of data through privacy laws, But we are now facing a crisis really of human rights with respect to privacy, and this cannot be faced with administrative regulations. I think that really we need to look into social responsibility, social safeguards, and individuals' responsibility too, because very often we rely on institutional guidelines on how to treat privacy, how to carry our research and so on, but researchers and individual citizens also carry a responsibility on how we are developing this data world.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience for following us here today. We are very grateful, and we hope that you've learned a lot about open science and you now know exactly how it should be governed. Thank you.